Hi, everyone. It's great to be back here. I really love International House in High Park, and when I was a little boy, I went to lab school down the street for a few years, and I love this room. I had a great time with Christopher Hitchens in this room once. I had absolutely no control over him. We're going to talk about Caitlin's book, Indebted, How Families Make College Work at Any Cost. And it's a really interesting, when I walked in the room and said to her the other day, I enjoyed it as a capitalist critique. It is a kind of a critique of what we've done to our higher education system in our capitalist system. And I wanted to know how you got into this, Caitlin, because you're an anthropologist. You don't have to turn the lens on your students, but you turn the lens on your students. Why did you do that?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's been quite a journey. I started off actually in my anthropological work here in Chicago doing research on futures traders at the Chicago Board of Trade. So the journey from there to doing research on students, was definitely including quite a turn for me. But I was sitting in my office one day, and I had been teaching at NYU for some number of years, and one of my students knocked on my door, and she came in, and I saw that she was in tears. And this was quite a shock to me because it was a young woman who was about to graduate, and she was going to go off into the world. I assumed finding all sorts of opportunity and open arms, but her tears really spoke otherwise. And when she came in and I asked her what was wrong, she talked about how not only was she tens of thousands of dollars in debt, but her mother was as well. And so it was my student who really showed me that the most important subject that I could be studying was actually right around me all the time.
And the interesting thing about this student, correct me if I'm wrong, is she was, she had been studying people who were working in bodegas and things in New York, and she was almost going to have to do the complete opposite of what she was studying to get a job to pay for her college.
Exactly. One of the reasons that she was crying was that she'd actually found a high-paying job, one which would allow her to make the payments on her debt, but which would also be helping a company offshore American jobs that would have otherwise stayed in this country.
So that's like the nutshell of the whole thing. You've got such interesting framing in the book about what's going on with our student debt, and one of the things that I guess would probably interesting to you about this was that there's a certain amount of silence in our families and in our communities, whether it's in a university, about what is really happening. And that young woman cried and kind of broke through the silence of, oh my gosh, here's my real situation, whereas people normally do not talk about it, and we have created this culture of silence about our finances and how we muddle through one of the biggest things that is hurting people in this country.
That's right. The silence issue, I think, was one of the most profound ones that I faced. You know, there's that old joke that Americans will more likely tell you about their sex lives than their salaries, and that is absolutely true also about their debts, and especially what they owe to make their middle-class lives work. So I actually, as a researcher, ran into this all the time. It was very, very difficult to find the parents and students I spoke with about how they paid for college, the kinds of pressures that student debt put on their families. People did not really want to expose those issues, and one of the reasons why it was so important for this research that Kimberly brought the issue to me was that she really opened up her heart, and then she, drove me to Pennsylvania to meet her mother and her mother's family, and they kind of took me in to tell me the depth of their story, which included her mother growing up as a single parent and trying to manage her credit so that her talented daughter could go to college based on the loans that she envisioned taking out for her. This is a kind of pressure that we usually don't even think of when we think about college. We think about college as happening, between the ages of 18 and 22, but it starts so much earlier on in people's family lives and has so much of a deeper resonance for people.
And their particular family, it's about potential. You've got a chapter in the book about how many families bet on the potential of their children to launch themselves into a better life rather than what would be economically wise for the, I guess that's how we get into this situation, that people are overwhelmingly, I think more than I thought before I read the book, are betting on their children's potential rather than betting on doing an economically smart thing.
Yeah, one of the key kind of tensions that I found and I write about in the book is that on the one hand, we tell families that they need to think very long term about their finances and to plan meticulously to pay this high cost to get their kids to and through school. So we put an enormous amount of financial pressure on families on the one hand. On the other hand, the idea that parents should in fact value their children's futures not in dollars and cents, but with the kind of unique potential of each child goes explicitly against that sense of kind of financial constraint we ask people to respect. So we're placing them inside a moral conflict. On the one hand, an idea that they have the responsibility to react to all of the financial pressures, and then on the other hand, if they want to be good parents, to value potential beyond price itself, to do absolutely anything they can to get their kids and young adults themselves off to a life that they choose.
Yeah, it's interesting. You've got a chapter, one of your initial chapters is on the 503, is that the 503Bs? Is that what they call them?
The 529s.
529s.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, we're going to have a chapter on the 529s? But it was really interesting because that is almost like the mental grooming for what you were talking about there, like we've got to save our whole lives. And it doesn't matter that nobody's doing it. We've just got to instill in people the idea that you should be doing it. If you aren't, you are flawed. And it's almost more of a framing device for the capitalist culture rather than something that is useful to anyone.
Right. The 529s are one of my most favorite policies to rail on because they make almost no kind of logical sense. For those of you who don't have them, in that kind of number salad of policies that we foist on people, 529s are tax advantaged private investment accounts that are invested in mutual funds, and almost no one actually uses them. Fewer than 5% of Americans use these things. So you really have to ask, what are those 529s for if barely anyone uses them? And of course, the people who use them have wealth far beyond the average, far, far, far beyond the average.
And they just use it as a tax shelter for
they
their
use
college
it,
stuff.
Yeah, yet another one. So so 529s don't really make any sense at all in terms of policies, but they are a very clear message to people, and families learn about them very early on in their child's lives. And that message is, you better save a lot, you better save monthly, and this has to come before everything else. And of course, we're also asking families to spend money at the same time. So that's one of the things that is such a kind of vise that people feel. So on the one hand, you're supposed to save in these plans. On the other hand, you need to be paying for a home in a school district where your kid can get a good education. We're going to cut your kids' art programs in their public school. So if you want that, you're going to have to pay for that privately. Sports teams. And this isn't, not let alone the earliest years where people have to pay enormous amounts of money. So there's this conflict between planning and those kind of present issues that parents face is incredible, in terms of the pressure that people feel.
I am one of the 3% who started one, even though I don't know the number of it. Mm-hmm. I stopped doing it because it wasn't adding up, and I needed the money, right? So it was kind of like just what you said. So I think I had $5,000 when my kid got into college from one of those, and it was perfectly useless. I have 2 kids. One graduated recently, one's in his last year of college, and I might refer to them repeatedly. The other document you talk about in the book is the FAFSA document, which everyone who goes to college these days and wants aid has to have. And you talk about how families reflect on this document, and it is going to decide how much their college costs. It is like a tax document or something, and no, I think the way I've always looked at it was it's like a tax document. The tax code isn't necessarily fair. I don't expect this document to be necessarily fair, and I did not expect, a fair number to come out of it. Mm-hmm. Is that is a reasonable way to look at this document?
Mm-hmm. Well, so it is. So the free application for federal student aid, which I still have to think about it. It's such a strange kind of name to put on this thing, but it is it is full of these chart fields. Like a tax document where you have to fill things in in their appropriate slots. One of the strange things about it is that the student, him or herself, is supposed to fill it out. Clearly, you did, which is what I found.
It's impossible. The student has access to your tax forms or something?
Right. So that's in itself a strange kind of piece of this artifact, is that it's addressed to the student as if their parents are just going to simply sit there with them and reveal all of this financial information, oh, sure, honey, here's how much I make, and here's how much our house is worth, and here's how much child support I pay or don't, right? So those sorts of questions are usually not, they're not ones that students themselves can answer. So parents end up filling it out and then handing it over to the student to kind of sign on the dotted line, and then the number that gets spit out, oftentimes does not feel fair at all. And so you say that you don't expect fairness, and that is reasonable, but many people also do expect it to be fair because this is such an enormous part of their family life, and they feel shocked when all of those numbers don't add up to something that they feel like they can pay.
And the thing about the FAFSA that you discuss in the book is how it leans towards what it considers a normal family. It wants you to have a house. It wants you to have a married parents who are both working good jobs. It has a normative quality to it that does not apply to many people.
Right. It very much looks for answers from a nuclear family, from a 2-parent family. We got rid of mother and father, now it's parent 1 and parent 2, but nonetheless, it is a nuclear family with children in residence in the house that that the parents are responsible for, and that those are their primary dependents. So one of the things that it doesn't account for is responsibilities beyond that very, basically the white picket fence, responsibilities to support grandparents who might be ailing, responsibilities to cousins who you're helping out for school. Any responsibilities that come outside those housing, that kind of house line, don't really register on the FAFSA unless someone is legally declared a dependent, which, the idea that you're going to declare a grandparent a dependent is actually an incredibly fraught idea, but of course that's one of the most common ways that families support people today. But that doesn't show up on the FAFSA at all. It's a fantasy of what a nuclear family looks like. That is only true for really the wealthiest Americans in this country, who also are not the ones who need the aid the most.
So you've got a bunch of examples of people who are not in that category in the book, and it's really it's wild what they go through. They're really wedging themselves in to make it work.
Exactly. They're when they can wedge themselves in. I mean, one of the biggest problems that students face is that when they have divorced parents, they have to have each of those parents reveal to each other essentially how much money they make or don't in order to make a decision about who is going to be the kind of primary one on the FAFSA document. It's, any kind of tension in the family is amplified around this document, which is the fundamental piece that families have to use in order to get aid. So of course, if you're in a family that already is facing a lot of tension, you're also more likely to be in a family that needs aid.
You've got an example of a young woman in the book whose mother seemed very supportive of of going to college, and they had seemed to be on the same page. And then it came time for her to reveal her finances, and she would not do it. And it totally screwed up their whole family dynamic.
It screwed up not only did it screw up their family dynamic, but she ended up in something called verification, which is a great sort of Orwellian word that the Department of Education uses for an audit. And that means that the student's aid was essentially threatened and ultimately taken away from her because she couldn't get the right numbers from her mother, whose income the Department of Education wanted to measure, and that cost this student enormous months of stress, and ultimately she withdrew from classes.
You also have a tremendous chapter on what African Americans go through in the college process, and you really do it historically in a way that brings the point home. And you've got one family, Ramona and Stanley Gates, and their son Stanley Jr., Stanley II. They tell the whole story. They almost do the whole chapter for you with their own educational history and right up to the problems they face with their son going to college.
Yeah, one issue that African American families face kind of more extensively than others is simply that college is an indispensable part of the condition of aspiration, right? So they want to be able to move up and to go to college, but college actually ends up costing them more personally. It might not have the same sticker price, but actually African American families who don't start with family wealth, who have faced discrimination in the labor market and aren't paid as much, all of these conditions end up eroding their ability to pay, and yet they value education for their children, like the Gates family did, in ways that make them very vulnerable to trying to get money basically at any cost. I mean, the family that I profile in the book, the Gates family, tried to raise money when their loans were denied from absolutely every corner they could possibly manage, from cousins who worked at Walmart, from their church family, they went far and wide to manage to put together the money that Howard University asked them to contribute.
And you are able to do the history of historically black colleges in the chapter and talk about their, how they got opportunities through that, and that they went and got graduate degrees, and then they had more student loans themselves later in life that was hurting them when their own son went to school. There was a whole, they were trying to do the right thing all the time, and they were in the hole all the time.
That's right. So the fact that we ask families to pay so much to go to college compounds the inequalities that already exist. So when African American families face these costs, it puts a burden on them in ways that it simply doesn't for most white families. And we know that on the student end, African Americans, and particularly African American women, carry more debt than just about anybody else.
And the way this family got in trouble was with plus loans, which are loans that you kind of go to if you can't get the baser, easier ones. And then the federal government changed how they evaluated plus loans, and they knocked out 400,000 students away from plus loans. So this wasn't just like this family had a hard time. It was disproportionately African American families who were applying for these plus loans. This was a large scale meanness that went on.
It really was. It's one of the biggest kind of education scandals that no one knows about. Basically in the wake of 2008, the Department of Education decided it was going to reevaluate how it gave out these loans, which go to families who can't borrow at lower rates, who can't essentially get like a home equity loan or perhaps borrow from wealthy relatives, say. But instead have to go to these plus loans, and they changed the standards, and yes, hundreds of thousands of students and their families got kind of thrown against the ropes without any warning. And without really any recourse, and that was why, it's one thing for a kind of incredibly determined, strong, like Ramona Gates to then kind of like take on the issue of trying to get their kid to school. But for most people, that's going to be absolutely impossible. And many students, particularly at the historically black colleges and universities, were unable to enroll or attend.
So what is the Department of Education now? How should we think about them? Because they just changed the rules. They acted more like, you described them acting more like a credit company than like a Department of Education. What is the Department of Education?
That's a great question. As far as higher education is concerned, it is more like a bank than anything else. It determines who has access to what kinds of grants and loans and what they can expect as far as aid goes. So that, to me, sounds a lot like a bank. And when we think about the Department of Education, it usually does not encompass those kinds of issues, but that's really how we should be thinking about it.
And the kind of lending they want to do is, when it comes to some of these for-profit colleges that we've seen in the news, it seems like they are sanctioning things that are predatory.
Yeah, right. So
they're a predatory bank.
Yeah. So one thing that happened under the plus loan scandal happened actually under the Obama administration. They tried to kind of walk it back. They were also at the same time going after for-profit colleges, which were essentially acting as a money funnel from the Department of Education through students to their investors' pocketbooks, without giving students a meaningful education and actually usually saddling them with debt that did not in any way pay off. I mean, today, we now have a Department of Education that is, Betsy DeVos was just fined $100,000 for failing to enforce basically the rules against predatory lending in for-profit colleges, and I mean that is a level of commitment to the for-profit scam that is really remarkable.
And we also had this interesting fellow, A. Wayne Johnson, who was appointed by Betsy DeVos as the head of the Office of Federal Student Aid a couple years ago, and he quit, and he is going to run for Senate, and he is saying that his signature issue would be canceling massive amounts of student loan debt, and he wants the Department of Education to get out of the loan business. What the heck happened there?
Right. Well, that was one of the great stunners the last month or so for me. So he said when he quit that the student debt system in this country is fundamentally broken. Those were his words. And so, of course, I agree with him on that. I do think it is fundamentally broken, and it is a surprise to have a self-identified Republican calling for debt cancellation. That has traditionally been, a left-leaning issue. But then the twist comes with wanting the Department of Education and the feds to get out of lending entirely, which to me is unrealistic in the extreme. But I think that's where the kind of right-wing, or I'm not sure what it is. It seems a little crazy idea comes from, because all the way back, through the 70s, the federal government has been involved in lending in one way or another, because banks had to be essentially, subvented in order to get them to do student lending in the first place. So, if we want students to have loans, which they need to have if we don't want them working all the time, then the federal government basically has to be in that business. So
you talk about what an anomaly it is that the United States is the way it is in the book, and that we have $1.5 trillion in loans. And the country you like and think is doing a smart job with loans is Australia. What is Australia doing?
Yeah, Australia is starting from a very different place than we have today in the United States. I mean, first, their system of higher education is much lower cost to begin with. So they already have much lower tuition than the United States, but they also have a very functional, even hard to say this, lending system that requires graduates to start paying only after they make a certain amount of money, a kind of median income.
And it's like $33,000 or something like that in our dollars.
Yeah, it's right. They do start paying, but they're not poor anymore when they start paying it. And then the percentages of what they pay on their income go up and down. So if they lose a job, it goes down. If they make more money, it goes up. And it's all done basically in a similar way to our payroll taxes, so that it's done sort of seamlessly. And so graduates don't really necessarily feel the pinch in the same way. It works to support them through their careers, instead of having to pay so much during the first 10 years of their working lives, the decade when students are most vulnerable once they finish school.
I'm sure you're kind of amazed at the what's happened to the debate over education in this country since the time you started this book to now. It has become a thing. Yeah. And we have a lot of Democratic candidates proposing a lot of different things. Do you have any particular one whose plan do you like?
Yeah, so I think that instead of thinking about it as kind of like which of these plans, which all have very different kind of moving pieces, I think that the thing that the Democratic field gets right, and actually even in some Republican states too, this is happening, that there's a move toward free tuition. And this sounds like a really radical idea, but it's actually a practice that we had in our country for decades. So I am a graduate of the University of California, and for many decades, the fees at the University of California were basically so negligible as to have no impact on students, and certainly not on their families. And so we have this in our history. It's just that we've gotten away from it. It's a commitment that we need to find again to higher education and to the possibilities that it opens up, not only for people's future incomes, which is how college education usually gets talked about, but also for our democracy, for our civil society. We need teachers, we need nurses, we need primary care physicians. All of these people have to go to college. And it's always really kind of amazing to me that saying that seems radical, when actually that's a commitment that we had, we held very closely, and then forgot somehow in the 80s and 90s. So it's really a return.
And so we did something where we made it all a personal thing rather than a community effort, rather than a national effort to educate our population to make our country better. It became a personal pride thing or a personal struggle.
That's right. There was a very clear and explicit shift in political morality in the 80s, and which carried through to revamping the higher education system in the 90s and today, that higher education was an individual benefit to students and parents, and that individual benefit could be measured in increased future income. So that education wasn't a public good, education was a private asset. And that shift in the way of thinking about education really fueled the expansion of loans. It backed the idea that the increased cost of higher education could basically go on forever, up to the point where it no longer paid off in individual terms. But that also just completely discounted all of the collective benefits that education gives and the commitment to our futures that it represents.
Do you have an ideal of what our field of choices should look like in the future? Because we have these public universities and private universities, and there's lots of them, and the public universities cost as much as the private places now, and there's a crazy quilt of people who are offering free tuition in New York or Kalamazoo, or all sorts of pockets that are doing free tuition. What would a perfect thing look like?
I think that we have to get back to the model like of the University of California that I described, which is also now being proposed by the governor of New Mexico, actually. So the University of New Mexico, if the governor can get this policy through the legislature, will also be free for everyone. Strengthening the public colleges and universities is absolutely the thing that I think that we have to do first and foremost. And that also means making sure that every student, every potential college student in the state knows that they will be able to go for free. That's really important for kids who are growing up, whose parents are teachers, or who are lower income kids whose parents never went to college. You have to think about universities and the costs as shaping the conditions of their aspiration. And so getting back to free tuition, I think, is really essential.
Is there something nefarious that's been going on where, I mean, like our state is broke and it doesn't want to fund the universities, and you know, so they are raising money any way they can,
Sure.
and the University of Illinois is, you know, got the highest percentage of international students of any university in the nation or something, and it almost seems like we're pushing people out of the system into the private colleges and fracturing this kind of trust, this public trust that we're talking about.
That's absolutely right. I mean, so the University of Michigan really pioneered this model in the 1980s. It's kind of called a high tuition, high aid model. So it's basically that the public colleges and universities set aside seats for out-of-state or out-of-country students who can pay the high fees that maybe they don't want to charge to average families from Michigan. But of course, what that does is, it crowds out people from Michigan, and then also it's a message, it's a signal that these universities are not really for you. And actually, the University of Michigan in particular had a huge problem with middle and lower income people from Michigan not applying to Ann Arbor because they were getting some signal that it wasn't for them. And they had this enormous marketing campaign to try to reverse that. But the kinds of shifts that we were just talking about, and our messages to the people whose states those universities are located in.
We're going to take questions. It's true.
Hello. So we'll be moving into our Q&A now. We just ask that you please speak into the mic and ask your question in the form of a question. My colleague and I will be circulating with mics, so raise your hand if you have one.
Could you comment on cooperative education or work-study programs? That seems to be incredibly weak and underutilized as a way to emerge debt-free.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. Work-study programs are a kind of normal part of aid packages that are offered by the federal government. But I think that it would be really interesting to look at expanding work as a way to pay fees, not within this kind of federal system, but at the university level. That could really have more traction. And schools like Berea College in Kentucky are doing work on that and have for the entirety of their hundreds of years. Well, I think that more people like you should raise the issue with your alma maters.
We have one house right.
Hi. I myself am in huge amounts of debt. In 4 years, I'll be with $500,000 debt after medical school. So I appreciate that you're raising the issue. What does it say about our society, in your opinion, that we are capitalizing education in the way that we're doing it? And do you think it's immoral? And if so, how do we change that shift of thinking so that families are starting more to raise the issue and say, this is immoral, rather than I'm going to do anything I can to try to support the education of my child?
Yeah. So I think that's a very good point. But as an anthropologist, what I would say is that it is moral, but it is a kind of morality that we have to contest. So the idea is that being responsible means taking on debt and looking for work that will pay that off. That's a kind of idea of responsibility that we've been telling people they should do. And in the medical field, that has certainly distorted what medical students feel like their options are on the other end. And so we all know that we need general practitioners. We all know that we need pediatricians. But what we have is really, really a lot of highly trained technical specialists, even though the crisis of our system means that we need more general practitioners period. So the costs of something like medical education are usually sort of defined outside of this crisis. I mean, even my book is really about four-year colleges and universities, but we need to be thinking about this more broadly too as a question of how we send messages to people about what they should be doing. Should they be looking to the public sector? Should they be looking to contribute to their communities by taking jobs that are paid less, or do they need to be focusing so heavily on getting the highly trained, plastic surgeon education that will help them pay off their debts?
What are your thoughts on programs where students can get a break on tuition, but then commit to, say, teaching in an underserved area or being a nurse or something in that line?
Yeah, I think that any kind of break that students can get at this point is a good one, but I think that we should be thinking about price in a different kind of way. That price is a signal of belonging to begin with. So when people say, when young people say they want to be teachers, we shouldn't sort of start them off with so much debt that they then have to look for these special programs in order to get a break. And in fact, like for instance, there is a program called the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which teachers in particular are supposed to be eligible for, but which something like, and I mean this quite literally, 1% of teachers can get entry into. So even the programs that are supposed to be giving a discount to people who want to do public interest work are not working. So we shouldn't be kind of increasing the number of means testing programs. We really need to be looking at the price of college as being prohibitive to people who want to do the kind of work we need them to do very much.
We have a question in the center.
Hi, I want to confirm something and then I have a follow-up question. Did you say that we should have free colleges for everyone, free public college for everyone?
Free public college for everyone.
Oh, okay. Don't you think that would start to get abused? Like me personally, I feel like it should be more affordable, like $4,000 to like $8,000, $9,000, where students don't have to turn to their parents. There's no stress, and students ourselves, like we can work and pay it as we're like studying.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that is another option, and the Australian model has people paying for a school. The issue isn't whether or not people pay eventually. I mean, so one of the things that I think is a strange issue in our current debate is that we look to colleges and universities as places where redistribution can happen, okay? So that's part of this kind of like high tuition, high aid model that I was describing. So for some reason, we can talk about that, taking the fees from people who can pay and kind of like recycling them into the system to pay for people whose families have lower incomes. We can do that in college, but we shouldn't be doing that in college. We should be talking about that in the tax system. So once you start talking about an actually progressive taxation system, these issues about who pays what specifically, and should they pay nothing, should they pay $2,000, that starts to fall by the wayside. So what it seems like to me is that, I mean, you and I can debate and come up with some reasonable position about how much individuals should pay right now, but that there is really a problem in the political debate, which is that we can talk about redistribution around higher education, which is actually one of the places that is least well positioned to do it, right? We should be looking to our higher education system to give people educations, not to make up for the inequalities in our country that already exist.
Can you comment on community college as a way of ameliorating the cost of college and why our middle-class kids think that going to community college is a stigma?
Mm-hmm. Well, so community college is great, and one of the ways that the University of California has been really successful at educating particularly low-income students is by encouraging a transfer after community college into both the Cal State and the UC system. So that is a tried and true path. Many community colleges are now free, even in states like Tennessee, which is obviously a very traditionally Republican state. Community college is free. I think that the issue, again, isn't that we should be trying to increase ways to kind of get around these costs. We should be starting with questioning those costs themselves. Community college is great. It has a clear place. Should it be about skirting the cost issue? To me, that not really. We should be trying to establish colleges and universities as places where students can really take advantage of the education and of the social opportunities that they provide for all 4 years. I think that we need to be focusing on that experience.
And you don't mention community colleges at all in the book, and I thought, and I was thinking about this, and I looked up, because I thought everybody was scamming on tuition by going to community college, and the community colleges were booming. But in the last 10 years, they're going down in enrollment.
Yeah.
There was some of it, but then they've been struggling again. So people don't do it. It reaffirmed your theory in the book, your idea that people are prioritizing their children's potential over affordability and scamming the system.
Right. Well, and one of the issues is that in general, community colleges are very much under-resourced. So unless you have a very strong community college system, then it is really a compromise to do that versus going to a 4-year school. Also, one of the reasons that for-profits are doing so, well as far as enrollment goes, is that community colleges aren't the kinds of robust institutions that they need to be. So the for-profits can come in and essentially prey on students who should be going to community college for free or very low cost.
We have a question, House Right.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your book. And I realize you just said that this isn't your ideal vision, but I find myself, I have cousins and siblings that are younger than me, and they're trying to asking me figure out, what they should do. Should they go to college? And as someone who graduated 10 years ago from this very school, and to put it bluntly, I regret it. I see that there's certification programs and coding boot camps, not in every field, but in certain fields, and I feel tempted to tell them to just skip college altogether because it's not worth the debt. And if you can get certified, that it's a much better program. Until things change, until the system changes, am I giving them disastrous advice? Am I ruining their life by telling them this? Or is college still essential for you to be viable in the workforce, even with the debt?
Well, I don't think that, you're certainly not trying to ruin their life, but the numbers say that basically you have to have a college degree, and that's one of the things that parents that I worked with got right. They may or may not know the statistics, but the premium on a college degree is incredibly high. Basically, you need a college degree to get a job that is going to pay well and be stable and give you the opportunities that you want going forward. That's what the statistics say. In part, it's because not having a college degree has become a condition for instability and insecurity. So the bottom has dropped out, so that having a college degree kind of functions as a safety net. And I would also say that having a college degree and versus these kinds of certification programs is that having a college degree is durable. Certification programs are only good for whatever technology happens to be in the moment. And we know that that's changing incredibly rapidly. So the value of a college education is actually being able to to cultivate yourself and then to learn how to do that again and again and again and again as conditions change. And that is actually a vision of what education should do for our democracy, not only for people's job prospects. That idea that we should be able to use our educations to reinvent ourselves and our country and our economy simultaneously was a vision that John Dewey laid out at the beginning of the 20th century, and it remains as true and valuable today as it was when he wrote it.
So we have time for just one more question, and then you can join us for a book signing out in the lobby.
I think my voice is loud enough. College costs, as I understand it, outstrip inflation by a long shot.
Yeah.
What do you attribute that to?
There are many answers to that question that are out there, but I would highlight two. The first is that over the last several decades, colleges and universities have had a vast increase in the number of highly paid administrators, not the people who like run the departments, but the sort of executive tier of colleges and universities. That is a clear cost pressure in public and private colleges both. But given my concern about what is happening to our public colleges and universities, the biggest issue to me is that state legislatures have been cutting away at university budgets for decades and decades at this point. So, for instance, I was just talking to the University of California, Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, which now gets 7% of its budget from the state of California. It gets 93% of its budget from tuition and philanthropy, essentially. So is that a state college anymore? I mean, or is that a college that needs a recommitment by the governor of the state of California to put forward the idea that the young people of California need to be educated for that state, for the good of that state, and that that's true across the country?
I think we're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thanks, Jerome.